further information about our panelist and moderator, you can visit our website, that is www.aklf.in. We will be beginning with our session now. Just a request to our panelists that let's try and stay on schedule. So maybe we can go into the audience question and answer round around 2 to 10, if that's okay. Because we hope to wrap up with the session by around 2:20 to 2:30. Thank you so much. I'll hand over proceedings to the both of you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for waiting. Sorry, we are a little late. We could begin the session by talking about Uber and Ola woes, which I'm sure all of you can all have stories to share about that. But we will stick to the subject at hand, and thank you again for your patience. So, welcome to Kolkata, welcome to Apeejay. And so, why is this long gap that happened between God of Small Things and Ministry of Utmost Happiness?
I had to let the work drip down inside me slowly.
Sorry, I couldn't. But has this ever happened to you?
What?
Where people have mixed up Arun the Roys?
Well, just as you experience with
Yeah, because it happens to me all the
Chotyajit
time
son.
with Chotyajit's
Yeah.
son here, where people
Yeah.
come expecting to see me, see him and find me.
Not only do they mix me up with her, then they are somewhat outraged that I have the similar name, as though I sort of planned it in my childhood, that one day there would be Arundhati Roy writing, and one day I would also be writing, and therefore it would be a canny move to have the same name and to get some of her sales.
This could be a novel. the Shadow Roy.
But there was a British writer in the 50s and 60s whose name was Elizabeth Taylor. So I think she had it much worse than I did. Taylor spelled Taylor.
Lor.
Yeah.
It's like, I would have changed my name. Oh, well, unless you want to just go with it and cash in on it, I guess.
Yeah.
But to come back to Anuradha Roy and the subject of the session today, the title of the session is from a poem, and I'll read a couple of lines from that poem for those who are not aware of it. Time will say nothing, but I told you so. Time only knows the price we have to pay. If I could tell you, I would let you know. So, Anuradha, as a writer, time for most of us is something that just passes, and Kolkata is a city which is the king of passing time. But as a writer, has writing changed how you look at time? Because time is a tool for a writer as well. This book unfolds in real time, in flashback, in letters that are read in real time but serve as flashbacks. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship with time and writing?
Apart from feeling that there is too little of time, the book is written from the point of view of a man who is now in his late 60s, and he is recalling something that happened to him when he was 9 years old, which was when his mother inexplicably left and went away to Bali. And now in his 60s, he feels the need to make sense of what had happened to him. So as Sandip says, the book, actually the book is like it's a kind of concert of voices, as well as these shifts in time. Because I think
Concert of voices. Maybe don't say concert. The
Yeah.
concert starts off
Maybe
in the
concert starts off the whole thing. I think I'm going to have a fit of giggles now. Anyway, I shall try to be serious about the book. No, so the book really was written, it contains letters from this child's mother to him, which he reads many years later. It has the voice of many historical people are included in the book. It crosses history and fiction together. So there is a German artist called Walter Spies. There is a British dancer called Beryl de Zoot. There is a singer called Begum Akhtar. In all these cases, I tried to look at their, things they had written and incorporate their voices. So that, and I translated parts of a novel by Moitrey Devi, which is also, there are short excerpts from it because her life had parallels with the life of my heroine. So between all of this, to plan out the whole way that the novel would move back and forth, because it's told in the voice of an old man as well as in the voice of a child. So in his own mind, the narrator is moving quite sharply between these times, and yet the seams were not to show in the movements between these two spaces in his life. So for me, it was a question of building the whole thing from these disparate things and yet not having the seams showing.
I mean, the book starts with the absolutely arresting line, which is, in my childhood, I was known as the boy whose mother had run off with an Englishman. The man was, in fact, German. And of course, anyone reading those lines at first will think, people of a certain generation here will think about the scandal here when Shonali Dasgupta ran away with Roberto Rossellini, leaving a husband and child behind. So you think elopement. But this is a far more interesting kind of elopement of why she goes, because the man she runs away with, Walter Spies, is actually gay. Yeah. So this is so what did you want to explore about this idea of why people would run away from the quote-unquote normal, happy life?
I think for me it was very important that Gayatri leave, not because of love, but because of her passion for her work. And what I wanted to explore really was the question of women like Gayatri and Begum Akhtar who have powerful sexual impulses, and yet that is not the dominant thing in their life. And that her sense of affinity with Walter Spies had much more to do with their temperament of needing to create art and needing to create a world in which that art could be created.
And because in the book, we see two kinds of freedom struggle is happening. Yeah. So one is the independence movement in India that's going on, and which Nek Chand Rosario, Gayatri's husband and the narrator's father, is involved in. And the other is Gayatri, striving for her freedom. And those two are not meshing. So what I loved about the book is that there are different kinds of patriarchy at work. Nek Chand Rosario is a very good, decent man. Many of us might recognize parts of our own fathers in him. He's a man of good principle. He's not the patriarch like we see in the Bengali soap opera where, you're one step away from honor killing your child at any moment, or your wife. So how did you want to approach this much more difficult phase of patriarchy of the good man who is still unable to let his wife breathe?
What I really had in mind when creating the relationship between Gayatri and Nek Chand, I was really thinking, what if Gandhi and Tagore had to share a house? Would they be able to live together? They are both good people of strong principles, but they are completely different. So at the time that this book happens, which is during the Quit India movement, when Gandhi was telling poets to stop writing because of devoting themselves to the nationalist cause, and to, turn away from all foreign influences, Tagore was saying something quite different, to keep your mind open and to realize yourself through your own individual genius, basically. So the battles between Gayatri and her husband are not really marital spats. They are much more far-reaching than than a domestic. I mean, in this sense, Gayatri is very different from other women in literature like, say, Madame Bovary, who is bored with her life. Gayatri is not bored. It is just that she has a completely different notion of her life than what her completely decent husband thinks she ought to have.
And in the book, at various points, both of them are leaving the boy Mishkin behind. She goes off to Bali, and he goes off to sort of find himself in a kind of pilgrimage in India. But hers would be viewed as a kind of extreme act of selfishness.
Yeah.
His would be viewed as a kind of selflessness.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting. That's such an interesting point, because many readers, particularly male readers, but also many women readers, have thought that Gayatri is self-centered and selfish, not that she is left home for something that is greater than herself, which is her need to create this art. And particularly in our culture, I find that traditionally, from the Buddha to Dharmanand Kosambi, even Gandhi, I mean, Gandhi's incredible anti-imperialism, his wonderful struggle for freedom has all kind of pushed aside the patriarchy of dictating what his wife's life should be at all times. And
Unto death.
Unto death. And Dharmanand Kosambi, when he left his home on his quest for scholarship, for which he has been justifiably valorized, because from being an illiterate villager, he taught himself to a point where he reached Harvard and learned Sanskrit and taught Sanskrit. But nobody remembered that he left his wife and children behind. Nobody condemns him from that, but many would condemn Gayatri, absolutely, because she's a woman doing something for herself here.
Yeah. And come much closer home, nobody condemns a certain prime minister who has left his wife, but is praised as being almost like an aesthetic.
Yeah, this turning away from domestic life is seen as a symbol of male strength somehow, but of female perfidy.
I thought maybe, since you brought up Tagore and Gandhi, I mean, that their differing ideas on nationalism play a part in this book, because that is something people are struggling with. And I don't know whether when you were writing this book, the debate about nationalism was at such a fever pitch in the country as it has become lately, about who is nationalist, who is anti-national. But looking at it now, and these arguments that were such living arguments in the book, do you feel the echoes?
I was perfectly aware of them when I was writing it. Because when in the beginning, actually this book started in a very odd way. Because I had been given a commission many years ago to write very tiny stories of about 100 words each, which were to be printed in invisible ink on tea bags. This was a company in Singapore, I think. And the idea was that while the tea was soaking, you would hold that tea bag over the vapor, and the words of the story would appear, and you would read it, and then as the paper dried up, the words would again disappear. And I found this quite magical, this whole sense of a story being like a kind of dream, which you can sometimes get a wisp of and then you lose it again. So one of the stories I wrote for this tea bag was about a woman who had the ability to enter pictures. And one day her husband comes back home early, and he doesn't notice that she is not in the house, but she is inside the mattress that's hanging in the wall, and she's perfectly naked and appearing to have rather a good time. But he doesn't see any of this. So I think when I was writing this novel, then one of the mother basically came out of this girl who was, but she became the son as It split into two. And at that time, I was trying to figure out which artist should this boy love. And that's when I kind of made this connection with Walter Spies, because I was in Bali. I saw his paintings, and he had, in fact, been Rabindranath's guide in Bali. He was his, in the 20s, when Rabindranath went to Java and Bali, Spies was his guide, and I found them to be very similar in their sense of the world as a kind of entity where intelligence, humanity, and art mattered more than national boundaries. And at that time, because Spies had escaped Germany in order to live life away from the Nazi shadow, I began to see that this whole period of Rabindranath meeting Spies, Spies leaving Germany, later being killed in the war, has very striking parallels with our own time, and I did try to explore those through the book.
Do you think Rabindranath would be an anti-national now?
I think, well, at that time, he was seen as an anti-national even then. He went through being called seditious. He went through, from the papers in, even here in Calcutta, they called him all kinds of names at that time. So,
you know, when I was reading the book, I have to confess, I didn't know Walter Spies was a real person. It was only at the end when I read the notes, I was like, oh, and then I went and read more about him because I was curious about this person. And it struck me as to why you decided that you would have the real Walter Spies meeting the fictional Gayatri in India, when the real Walter Spies never actually managed to come to India himself. As opposed to, say, the easier way out, which is a Walter Spies-like character, influenced by him, but, you know, safe from the particulars of his life.
No, I was really interested in the, basically there are two kinds of historical novels. One would be the Walter Scott and Hilary Mantel kind, which are very imaginatively, but recreating a world of a past time, but absolutely sticking to the documentary evidence that they want to look at. And the other kind is this, which plays around with the, because what do we know of history? We only know what is written down. We have no access to whatever is thought to be the truth. So we are free to imagine what that truth might be. So that's, I mean, I really did think that it would be easier for me to change his name, to have someone like him to draw on his life, and then I'd be saved a lot of headache. But instead, what I really wanted to do was to have, and I have to confess that as I was working on the book, I had a kind of crush on Walter Spies, because he is just so incredible. He is, not only is he mind-bogglingly handsome, he was so
Was
gifted.
he actually?
Yeah,
he was.
He was so amazingly gifted. He could learn languages like that. He went into prison for several years of his life. First, he was in a prison camp in Russia. Then he was in a prison in Sumatra. And in both places, he managed to enter these cells and make music and paintings in them. He learned languages in them. And then I felt that here's this man who, if I said to him, I'm going to put you in a book, can I change everything in your life and make it up? He would have said, go ahead, I'm interested. So that's why I did that. I really felt as if I was in touch with him.
But at the same time, when I was reading about it, I learned that at the end there was this whole controversy about whether he was gay or a pedophile, you know, and that he was charged with corrupting young boys and having exploitative relationships with Balinese boys. Now, I don't know how much of that was true, how much of it was being framed by people who hated him, but as a writer, like, what kind of quandary does that put you in? Because you're writing in the voice of Gayatri and her relationship with this man. So even if you know that there might be something iffy about his past, as a, you know, as a journalist, you would feel compelled to put it out there. As a writer writing in the voice of Gayatri, you have to look at him differently, because people like Margaret Mead came to his defense. So how did you deal with that? I mean, there are allusions to it in the letters.
I really had to, I actually sympathized with the point of view that came through in all the history that I read about Spies. First of all, there was the point of view that he had not been a pedophile. That was established, that most of the evidence that was given in the courts were cooked up. They had a very hard time finding anyone to say that there was a child he had exploited. Secondly, there was this very interesting notion of the Balinese concept of time, which was quite different from the Western concept of time. So the Balinese themselves were absolutely astonished that he should be jailed for a sexual life which they felt everyone had been in willingly, and they were not children. They were young, but you know, the concept of a Western underage was maybe not the Balinese. They didn't know their ages very precisely anyway. But Margaret Mead and co. did go into all the... So I felt that I was willing to accept her evidence, and I would not let that come in the way of whatever undying love I had now conceived for him.
So let's hear a little bit from the book. So do you want to read a little bit?
I'll actually, since you mentioned time, I'll read a bit about time and memory. This is in the voice of the narrator, whose name is Mishkin, and he is about to begin writing this book. In telling the story of any life, and certainly when telling our own, we cannot pretend we are narrating everything just as it happened. Our memories come to us as images, feelings, glimpses, sometimes fleshed out, sometimes in outline. Time solidifies as well as dissolves. We have no precise recollection of how long things took. A few days, weeks, a month. Chunks of time are a blank, while others grow to be momentous in retrospect. I believe this is true for most people. Over the years, when friends contradicted me over details, my uncertain hold over my memories began to make me think I would no longer recognize myself in old photographs. The person in those black and white images was somebody else. Think too hard, and you might think yourself into lunacy. In one of his poems, Rabindranath Tagore says, I cannot remember my mother, but when in the early autumn morning the fragrance of the shiv leaf floats in the air, the scent of the morning prayers in the temple comes to me as the scent of my mother. The poet lost his mother when he was 14. I was only 9 the year my mother left. How can it be then that she is as close to me as my own reflection in the mirror? Present in every detail, and yet imprisoned in a different element, unreachable. Entire conversations come back to me. Incidents, arguments, the way she would line her eyes with kajal, the fresh flowers in her hair, the circle of red kumkum on her forehead, which was invariably smudged by mid-afternoon. How she recited rhymes to make me memorize them. How her skin was the color of beaten gold. How her eyes slanted. How those slanted eyes had an impish gleam. I am certain I truly remember these things and have not built up impressions from stories and photographs. Yet the older I grow, the less certain I am of certainty. One of my mother's contemporaries, of whom I will have more to say later, wrote a book in which she recalled events from 42 years before. I can make no more than a clumsy translation of how she describes the machinery of time in the working of memory. As I went down the stairs, my body was trembling, she writes, and then interrupts herself to ask, did it happen that very day? I can't be sure. I kept no journal. I am writing neither from a diary nor from memory. I cannot tell if I am writing these events as they happened, one by one. But what appeared then as if they happened one by one, now they have neither beginning nor end. Now these days are simultaneously in my present. Oh, I cannot explain. Why is it so hard to explain? After all, Arjun saw the whole of the universe, past and present, in Sri Krishna's opened mouth. I too see things that way. You have to believe me. These are not memories. These are my present. At every moment, I am getting closer to the year 1930. I can feel the year 1930 on my skin.
Is there a year you feel on your skin?
I think I think it's probably the year I had to leave Hyderabad, which when I was 16 and deeply attached to my friends there, and my father got transferred and we had to leave. And whenever I think of that's where I return in my past.
So that excerpt that you translated, is that from Nahonnate, Moitri Devi?
Yes, it is.
So when you were writing, when you started writing this book, were you already aware of Nahonnate and Moitri Devi and that sort of parallel story, as well much of the Rabindranath Tagore stuff that works its way into the book, or did you discover that in the process of writing this book?
Actually, Moitri Devi is a relative. She was married to my father's cousin.
Okay.
But when she wrote Nahonnote, that caused such a... I now think, I didn't know at that time. It came out in the 70s when I would have been quite small. And there was no copy of the book in our house. Neither did... there was, there used to be contact. My mother has memories of plenty of contact with her as soon as she got married. But after this book, it seemed to come to a pause. After her revelations about her relationship with Mirza Eliade and so on. But I had never read the book. As I was working on this, although Gayatri does not leave him for love, I became curious about the actual mechanics of, how does someone like her in the 30s go about this, the practicalities? How would she go about it? So I read a lot of memoirs from that time, and this book came into my reading as a memoir of Calcutta, 30s, young girl, foreign man. And then I was absolutely gripped by the book, and I felt such an affinity between her and Gayatri that I introduced. I wanted to explore the parallels. That's why the translations are there in it.
Since she was related, if she had been around still, what would you have liked to know about this? Since you were, in a way, reading this, studying the practicality of how does this happen?
What would I have liked to know about?
From her.
From her, yeah, of course. Well, the book, up to the point that Mirza leaves Calcutta, is pretty detailed. Yeah. I felt it's a very incredibly powerful and passionate book up to that point. And then I felt a kind of falling away as... and also, it was a very odd thing for me to read this book because after this whole incident, she gets married. In the book, the girl, Amrita, who is the heroine, who is very closely modeled on herself, I think, just agrees to marry, almost like saying, you do what you like. She says, I'm not even interested in meeting who you're going to marry me off to. How does it matter? She goes through various arranged marriage parades and sees them with a comic and satirical eye. Those are wonderful, funny bits in the novel. And then she says, then she agrees to marry someone. It all has to be done in a hurry. And this someone in the book I know now was my father's first cousin. So here's this man who is going to marry her. She has refused to meet him. And he writes her a letter on the eve of their marriage, which her mother does not, parents exert so much control over her. Her father is another tyrant who is ruling his daughter's life. And they don't give her the letter thinking she may now not marry him after reading the letter. So she gets the letter later, and it's such a charming, beautiful letter saying, your mother examined me with as much attention as an Egyptologist in front of a mummy. And however you don't want to see me, that is fine, kind. I'm paraphrasing. And then he was the most tolerant of husbands, who she was very close to Rabindranath in a manner that might have made another husband uncomfortable. But he appears to have understood that she was a different kind of person who needed a different kind of relationship. So I found the whole process very moving and quite different from the relationship between Gayatri and her husband.
You know, your book opens with a quote from Tobias Wolff, where this is a book of memory, and memory has its own story to tell. And I wanted you to talk a bit about memory, because in other books as well, in Sleeping on Jupiter, Nomi has a sort of fractured memory, Gauri is losing her memory, and there are memories you wish to forget, and then there are memories you nurture, like a precious secret that only you know. And in this book, Mishkin is sort of setting down a record of memory. So talk a bit about memory and the act of writing, which we often say is a putting down memory.
Yeah, but I've been actually quite fascinated by the unreliability of memory. And Mishkin is a very unreliable narrator. He remembers quite a number of things. And yeah, there was this, I love the writing of Oliver Sacks. And I always go back to this thing he thought he remembered. So Oliver Sacks, who is a doctor, I mean, he's a psychiatrist.
He wrote
neurologist.
The man whose wife thought she was a bowler hat or whatever, no, something like that.
The man who thought his wife was a hat, which I really envy as a title. Anyway, Oliver Sacks wrote down a detailed memory of he's British by birth, and he was in London during the bombing of London in the Second World War. He had a vivid memory of the bombs falling in his garden and all that he did to escape and so on. And the shards of glass, everything he remembered. And after he had written this up, his brother wrote to him saying, but you were not in London when the bombing happened. You were actually in boarding school. You had been sent away for your own safety. And he then reflects that so many of our memories are created in our mind from things we have read or seen or heard. And yet they become so much a part of us that they are our memories, only of a different kind. So,
no, that's absolutely true. I have a memory, apparently, of when I was a kid, of my mother and going shopping at Newmarket with me, and I was sitting outside the store, they had gone in the store, and my memory is they left from the other end, forgetting me.
Oh, God.
And so that is my traumatic memory. And then the other day I was telling my mother this, and she was like, really? That happened? I don't remember this. And I'm like, how can you not remember losing your son? You know, and then like one of those guys who take people shopping around, Jhudiwalas, he kind of took me around, brought me back to the shop till my parents came back. And now I don't know whether my mother has in old age blocked it out or whether I over-imagined some story. So I have no idea if it's true.
Oh my God, what a terrifying thing.
But later in the book, when Mishkin, who is an old man, he says something which I found very moving, where he says, there are fewer and fewer people who could share my memories with me, either about people or about places. And I understand that acutely because on one level you're talking about the unreliability of memory. So as there are fewer and fewer people to share that memory with you, it's even more unreliable because nobody's kind of vouching for it. But when I see my mother now, I also realize this with her cousins dying, you know, sort of the lights going out one by one. I notice how she tells the same story over and over again. And I might be like, oh God, I've heard that story umpteen times. But then I realize, in a way for her, it's to reassure herself that it did happen.
I think her telling you is an act of creating the event for herself again and reassuring herself somehow that it happened, that it's real. And it's true that as Mishkin ages, he finds either those landscapes have changed beyond description. So the place, in this I really feel a sense of affinity because we used to have an old house in Calcutta, which is now a block of flats. And yet, in my nephew never saw that house. He was born after it was demolished. Yet in my mind, when I reach that bend of the road and I don't see that apartment block even now. Even now I can see that yellow house with the old wrought iron gate and the long corridor that led to the garden where we used to play. But this image exists now in my mother's mind, mine and my brother's, a few of us. Gradually there will be nobody who remembers that anymore. And that is what I was trying to, understand about Mishkin's age.
This is something I think that a lot of us can relate to. Many of us come from houses like that, which are now blocks of flats. Yeah. And my same thing happened to my house. And my mother still says she never dreams of the flat in which we've lived for 10 years or 15 years. Yeah. In the dream, she always dreams of the old house. And but since we're speaking of memories, let me ask you a little bit about yours. What was your father was a geologist. You say your father got transferred that moment. Yeah. What was your childhood like? What is your memory? If you were starting in my childhood, I was known as the girl. How would you finish that sentence?
I think we had just a wonderfully happy and slightly bizarre childhood, because the first, at least the first 7, maybe, no, not the first. My brother didn't start school till a bit late because both of us and my mother would follow my father on his field postings whenever possible. So we lived in tents in very remote wildernesses, and that's why I think I still need to be under an open sky at all times, and I live in a very wild place. And we learned to climb trees, go climb mountains. My mother had to wash clothes in a stream. We were told to watch over her in case she fell. There was no plan B, like what happens in case she fell. But we moved a lot from place to place because he got transferred. So I grew up in a lot of small places, of which Hyderabad formed the biggest chunk. So I have no trauma, thankfully, of either of my parents leaving me. But I think that many people tell me that the books are full of a sense of loss, all my books. And at first, when I started writing, I used to spend a lot of my life denying that my life had anything to do with the books, because I wanted to say, do you think I can't write fiction? I'm making this stuff up, and I am. But as I've grown into the writing and all these books, I've realized that your own life permeates the books. How can it not? That's where the books are coming from. And I think this sense of loss really comes from, first, my father used to go away on field postings and wouldn't be there for 8 months of the year when we grew up. Then he died when I was 19. And then there was this relentless uprooting. As soon as you made friends, you were on your way again to somewhere else. So that is probably the only unhappy part of my childhood.
Well, I mean, and obviously in Atlas of Impossible Longing, the father is going away as an archaeologist on field trips all the time. And I guess our lives seep into the books. I mean, the book is fiction, but there are bits of it that are stolen, borrowed.
I think I once read, it was, I think, Doris Lessing, who said she felt she had been a failure as a writer because she had not managed to create a single character who she felt truly didn't exist outside of herself. She felt that she was sort of shredding herself and then altering herself in order to make all the characters. And sometimes I do feel like that.
You feel like that?
Yeah, even
but are you at peace with that, or do you fight against it?
No, I think now I'm much calmer about the whole process.
Is the pottery helping that? I think we should open it up for questions, because I know they told us to try and end on time. So we have somebody ask a question. You can ask about her favorite color too. Like there is no, I think someone will have a mic.
Let's go.
No questions. Yes. Thank you. Somebody has to break
Who are
the
you?
ice.
Okay. Who is your imagined reader?
We can't hear you.
Who is your imagined reader, and how does that affect what you write?
I don't imagine a reader when I'm writing. I really feel as if that first draft, which for me is the most important thing, is a secret and wonderful time for myself. You know that little tea story that I wrote, and Mishkin here, who disappears into pictures, is for me what being a writer is. That you have an alternate world into which you can vanish, which is your own secret world when you're writing that first draft, and it feels completely incandescent writing it. And at that time, I'm not thinking of anyone. And for me, the ideal reader too is someone who can completely enter an alternate world. And that is the kind of reader I want, someone who can feel completely immersed in the world of the book, and as immersed as I did when I was writing it. The question of the practicalities of the reader comes in once my publisher has read the draft. And then he will tell me, I didn't get that part, this part is not working well, this bit is very confusing. Then I have to think of just how to make the narrative, clearer for the reader if I want to, or more opaque if I want it to. At that stage, I think, I suppose, of a reader much like myself. Someone with imagination who will not ask me to tie up every single last loose end.
Thank you for breaking the ice. See other people's data.
You seem to be a very free-spirited person and a writer. Is that a function of your upbringing or just your nature? Nature versus nurture type of question.
I don't know actually. Yeah. I'm just who I am, I guess. But I've also been, I know that I'm very lucky in having an upbringing where nothing was forbidden. That's absolutely true, because the way I started writing was when my mother gave me a red notebook which was blank when I was quite little. My brother started going to school before me, and I was very jealous, thinking he was being taken somewhere nice, what I was being denied. So to placate me, my mother gave me this notebook and told me, this is yours and you can do what you want. And it slowly began to fill up with stories. In the beginning, I remember the first story. There was a bear and it sat on a chair. And then gradually...
And what happened to the chair broke?
It just sat.
It just
It's
sat.
an open-ended short story. So that's how the writing began. And when I was about 13 or 14, yesterday, in fact, it was a very moving moment for me. I discovered my father's old typewriter because I came back home and I saw this thela on the floor. And I wondered what it was. And when I opened it, it was this typewriter, an Olivetti. And he had actually given it to me when I was 13, when he saw I was serious about writing. And he said, if you want to write, you need to learn how to type. And I learned to type on that typewriter and sent off stories, which they encouraged me to send to Indian Express, and they started getting published when I was a teenager. So I think it has quite a lot to do with upbringing, and after that, whatever it is.
Thank
I think
you.
there was a young woman there. Did you have a question? Somebody? I saw a hand up in the middle section.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Hello, ma'am. Firstly, I haven't read this book, so I had a question about Sleeping on Jupiter.
Okay.
So, like, towards the start of that book, when young Nomi is being, like, whisked around in a van to all these places,
Yeah.
so I felt like the scenarios felt a little bleak and dystopian. So, was that, like, a conscious decision you made, or, like, was I just feeling it?
No, it was completely conscious, because the sections, Nomi is a little refugee girl. She's lost her whole family in a very brief time. Then she's been bundled into, first she's been put on a boat, then she's been put into this bus. She doesn't know whether she'll see her family again. She doesn't know who she's with or where she's going. So it's a completely, like being lost in Newmarket, I guess. You just have no idea if you'll ever find them again. So the bleakness was very much intended.
Like the dystopian angle to it was like.
I wouldn't call it dystopian, but it was certainly what I wanted to show was the terror of not knowing whether you're a child or an adult, the terror of being completely lost and not knowing. But it was written from the viewpoint of a child.
Thank you.
Other? Could you hand the mic over to her in front, right in front of you? Could you take the mic? Yeah.
There's also an element of what if, right? If he had made the train and gone with his mother, if he hadn't been delayed, and also the neighbor, you know, who was really very kind to them. Could you just elaborate on that for me?
Well, the fiction, the whole of, I mean, the what if, the main what if in this book, for me in the beginning, was what if Walter Spies had made that journey to India. Because his death happened on the way to India. His ship was bombed on his way to Dehradun. And therefore, the whole structure of any work of fiction is there are a series of crossroads you come to while you're writing when you make these choices. Should I do this or should I do that? Not all of them, just before this, I was in Madras at the Hindu festival, and a young man came up to me looking pretty tearful at the end of a signing. And he said, I couldn't ask you this there, but why couldn't you make him find the letters when he was 18? Then there would have been a chance that he could have gone and found his mother. And I guess the novel that's written is the novel that's written. And you make these choices that he has not turned up in time, and he has therefore missed that train. Otherwise, the book wouldn't exist in its form.
Any more?
The Buddha who abandoned his wife and sleeping child and walked out.
Yeah, yes. Well, she did try to take him, this Gayatri.
That's the difference between the father and the
absolutely.
selflessness and the. Any other?
Take this.
Hello, good afternoon, ma'am. It was very nice and very inspiring listening to you. I am just introduced to you right now, and I took one book. I don't know which book you were just talking about, but what you described was just beautiful, you know.
Hello.
I could relate to all those things that you said, just like loss, you said, suffering, and many things you talk about childhood. I could, I was just sitting here and listening to you, and I felt I can relate to all those things that you were talking about, those lanes, those buildings, and then climbing the tree. Then you were also talking, there's always a sense of loss while you're living. That thing is always there. You described so beautifully, and it's really nice to hear you.
Question also about that?
No, it's just a comment.
Okay.
Thank you. It's a lovely comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I think we are pretty much out of time. So, is there one last short burning question? Otherwise, you'll be signing books, right? Yeah. So, I'm sure you can also, if there's a question you couldn't come up with here, you can ask it during the book signing. So, thank you again very much for coming, and please join me in thanking Anuradha Roy for coming to the Apeejay.
Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for listening. It was lovely. Thank you.
Discussion, there were these certain allusions to historical discourses of truth and the idea of nation and nationalism, which is perhaps more than anything else a product of a communal imagination, if you will. And then, of course, there are the questions of how time and memory and perhaps displacement can mediate these discourses of truth. There's the question of how these issues get gendered. And I think these are questions that are far more important now than they ever were before. So thank you so much, Anuradha ma'am and Sandip sir, for having joined us today and for having taken us through this discursive process. You can be there for the book signing that will happen at the Oxford Bookstore corner right here. And ma'am is going to be in a conversation, a session of interaction with our members of the press.